The tide slid back from the jagged coast and left behind pools of trapped fish that flailed helplessly in the shallow water. The salt air burned with the stench of seaweed and decay. High above, seabirds circled and screamed. On the rocks a lone figure moved with steady purpose. Its long jaws opened in silence. Its claws scraped the stone. Hunger drove its every step. The world here was harsh and wild, and no creature lived long without struggle. Shadows stirred behind the rocks. The question rose clear. Would the hunter feed or fall to something greater? The Middle Jurassic world was a place of constant change and unforgiving trial. Seas rose and fell across the land, leaving behind shifting shorelines of mudflats, estuaries, and lagoons. Volcanoes smoked in the distance, painting the horizon in haze, while forests of fern cycads and towering conifers reached skyward in defiance of the ever-restless earth. It was a world where survival was dictated not by comfort, but by raw instinct. Every day was a struggle written in claw-marked tooth scar and fading tracks pressed into wet soil. Among the many creatures that roamed this ancient landscape, one hunter carved out a place that was both precarious and powerful. The Eustreptospondylus stood tall and lean, a predator not as massive as the later tyrant of its family, but one that thrived through agility, patience, and cunning. Its slender frame balanced on two muscular legs, its arms tipped with claws sharp enough to tear through flesh, and its jaws lined with teeth built for seizing slippery prey. Unlike the giants that would one day dominate the land, Eustreptospondylus made its living along the coast, chasing the scent of rotting fish and the sound of waves crashing against stone. This predator lived in the borderlands between two worlds. To its left stretched the vast shallow seas teeming with life. Ichthyosaurs cruised through the depths, their bodies cutting sleek paths in the water. Plesiosaurs raised long necks above the waves, as if searching for prey below. Sharks and schools of bony fish darted in shimmering walls of silver. To its right lay the land itself. Herds of small plant-eaters browsed in the fern thickets. Crocodile-like reptiles lurked in the waterways. Above in the canopy, insect wings rattled like whispers of hidden danger. The shoreline where sea met soil was a place of opportunity, yet it was also fraught with peril. Eustreptospondylus made use of its unique strengths. Unlike the huge sauropods that consumed entire groves of plants, it needed no vast territory. Unlike the armored stegosaurs or spike-tailed herbivores, it carried no defenses beyond its speed and teeth. Its survival hinged on precision. It could not overpower larger foes, so it stalked the vulnerable, the weak, the cornered. Sometimes it scavenged, feeding on carcasses swept ashore by storms or abandoned by other predators too large to bother with scraps. Other times it hunted, actively darting from rock to snatch trapped fish or lunging at small dinosaurs that strayed too close to the tidal zone. But life on the coast was not simple. The sea was a constant reminder that danger lurked even in abundance. Plesiosaurs could surge in the shallows to snap a careless hunter in half. Crocodile-like reptiles ambushed at river mouths with jaws capable of dragging prey beneath the surface. Even the tide themselves posed a hazard. A predator that lingered too long in pursuit of fish might find itself stranded when the waves returned. Every moment required decision, and every decision carried risk. Despite the odds, Eustreptospondylus persisted. The landscape shaped it into a master balance. Neither dominant ruler nor helpless scavenger, it existed in the fragile middle ground, where strategy decided who lived and who vanished into the fossil record. It was a creature of edge zones, borderlines, and gray spaces. And in this uncertain realm, its story unfolded not as the triumph of an unstoppable giant, but as a relentless will of a survivor tested again and again. Here begins a tale of one such predator. A lone Eustreptospondylus, standing at the edge of hunger and opportunity. The tide had receded, leaving behind its promise of food. Yet in this place where sea and land collided, nothing was ever certain. The hunter's path would not be written by hunger alone. Conflict, predators, rivals, and chance would all rise to meet it. The story of its struggle was not just about survival for a single day, but about the eternal question of whether skill and cunning could overcome the endless jaws of a world that knew no mercy. The morning tide had drawn back from the shore, leaving behind a world of smells and sounds that ignited the hunger inside the Eustreptospondylus. The wet sand glistened in the pale light of dawn, streaked with the traces of crabs and fish caught in shallow pools. Gulls and pterosaurs circled overhead shrieking as they dove to snatch scraps of life left exposed by the receding water. For a creature that walked a thin border of sea and land, this was both a moment of opportunity and a test of patience. The hunter moved slowly across the wet ground, its long tail stretched out behind for balance. Its nostrils twitched, drawing the scent of saltfish and something far more enticing. There was a sweetness on the air, the unmistakable signal of flesh beginning to rot. It was the scent of a carcass, and where there was death there was food. The predator's yellow eyes narrowed as it adjusted its course, following the invisible trail toward the source. Across a stretch of tidal mud lay the remains of a young marine reptile. Perhaps it had been stranded by the tide or injured by larger predators of the sea. Now it was a broken body resting half buried in sand. Flies swarmed over its pale flesh, and the pterosaurs had already gathered, squabbling and tearing at the softer parts. The Eustreptospondylus slowed its approach. A free meal was always tempting, but never without risk. To claim it meant challenging the scavengers and risking ambush by others who might also be drawn to the prize. The predator stepped closer, its jaws open and closed in anticipation as it let out a low growl. The pterosaurs shrieked and flapped back, retreating from the carcass, but not flying far. They landed on rocks and sandbars just out of reach, waiting for their chance to return. The Eustreptospondylus pressed forward, claiming the kill as its own. With one swift bite, it tore away a strip of flesh, its sharp teeth slicing cleanly through. Warmth spread across its tongue as the taste of meat filled its mouth, and hunger urged it to gorge. Then the air shifted. A sound broke through the cries of seabirds and the slosh of waves. It was deep, heavy, and rhythmic. Footsteps. The hunter froze mid-chew, its head lifting sharply. Across the tidal flats, another predator was approaching. Larger, heavier, and stronger. The rival was a megalosaur, a close cousin, yet far more imposing in size. Its stride was confident, its massive jaws gaping open to reveal rows of crushing teeth. The sight made clear that this carcass was no longer unclaimed. The Eustreptospondylus hesitated, torn between fight and flight. Its body was built for speed and cunning, not brute force. To challenge a megalosaur was to risk being torn apart in moments. Yet to abandon the carcass meant more hunger, more weakness, and fewer chances in the days to come. The decision pressed hard like the tide itself, pulling one way then another. Instinct screamed to retreat, but pride and desperation anchored in place. The megalosaur drew closer, its eyes fixed not only on the carcass, but also on the smaller hunter that had dared to claim it. The pterosaur screeched louder, circling overhead, sensing the clash about to erupt. The air was charged with tension, as if even the sea held its breath. The Eustreptospondylus lowered its head and hissed defiantly, its tail lashing in wide arcs across the sand. It lunged forward to tear another mouthful from the carcass, as if to prove its claim. Blood and seawater sprayed across its jaws, while its muscles tensed for what was certain to come. The megalosaur answered with a roar that rolled across the shore like thunder. It was a sound of dominance, a warning that no smaller predator could ignore. Yet instead of fleeing, the Eustreptospondylus stood its ground. For the first time, its life was no longer only about the hunt or the scavenging of scraps. The world had shifted. Survival now demanded a test of courage against a force greater than itself. This was no ordinary morning on the coast. The choice the Eustreptospondylus made now would shape not just this day, but the battles to follow. Hunger had brought it here, but challenge had awakened something far deeper. Its story of survival had crossed into conflict, and there would be no turning back. Do you want to continue with Step 4, Rising Action, 1,500 to 1,700 words? Next, the roar of the megalosaur still echoed in the air long after it left the throat of the giant predator. The tidal flats had grown silent, except for the distant hiss of waves and the beating of wings from the circling pterosaurs. The Eustreptospondylus stood over the carcass of the stranded marine reptile, its chest rising and falling as adrenaline surged through its body. Hunger gnawed at its stomach, but danger loomed larger with each step the rival took forward. The megalosaur stopped only a few lengths away from the carcass. Its massive head lowered close to the sand as its nostrils flared, pulling in the scent of blood. The rival's eyes burned with the certainty of ownership. To it, the smaller hunter was no more than a nuisance, a thief who had dared to steal from its rightful prize. The Eustreptospondylus hissed, its tail slashing behind it like a whip. It could not hope to win through brute strength, yet retreat would mean days of further hunger. The tidal pools were shrinking, the shoreline offered little, and the forest beyond was filled with dangers just as deadly. Each failed hunt weighed on the predator like stones. This carcass was more than food. It was survival. With a sharp lunge, the megalosaur advanced, testing the smaller predator. Its teeth snapped down close enough to make the air shiver. The Eustreptospondylus darted back, its claws scraping across wet sand. Instinct screamed to flee, but something deeper held it there. It paced in circles, its eyes darting from the carcass to the megalosaur to the retreating tide. Ideas churned as quick as the tide. Perhaps the sea itself could be ally. The Eustreptospondylus darted forward again, grabbing another strip of flesh before retreating toward a shallow tidal channel. The megalosaur bellowed and gave chase, its heavy legs pounding the sand like drums. But the smaller hunter was quick and light, its feet splashing through water where the giant slowed. The Eustreptospondylus slashed through the shallows, then spun and hissed with blood dripping from its jaws. It had not won, but it had shown the megalosaur that claiming the prize would not come easily. The standoff stretched on until the megalosaur finally seized the carcass in its jaws and dragged it toward firmer ground. The smaller hunter roared in frustration, but dared not attack directly. It lingered at the edge of the flats, watching as gulls and pterosaurs resumed their circling overhead. Its stomach churned with hunger. To lose now was to fade into weakness. To survive, it would need cunning beyond instinct. For the next days, the Eustreptospondylus stalked the coastline hunting smaller prey, but always with the shadow of the megalosaur near. Fish darted away too swiftly. Crabs scattered into their burrows. Even scavenging was difficult, for the larger predator often arrived first. Each failure deepened its hunger until its bones pressed sharply beneath its scales. On the third dawn, fortune seemed to whisper a different story. The predator spotted a herd of small ornithopods grazing along the forest edge where ferns met open sand. Their heads lifted warily, their ears flicking as they chewed on leaves. The Eustreptospondylus lowered its body, slinking closer with every step. This could be the meal that changed everything. It launched forward. The herd scattered in panic, their high calls echoing through the trees. The hunter's legs pumped furiously, its jaws snapping at the trailing young one. For a moment, victory seemed close until the crashing roar of the megalosaur shattered the air. The giant had appeared again, charging from the shadows of the forest. Its massive body scattered the herd more effectively than the smaller hunter could. With one crushing snap, the megalosaur clamped down on a fleeing ornithopod and lifted it thrashing into the air. Blood sprayed across the ferns as the larger predator roared its triumph. The Eustreptospondylus stopped in its tracks, rage and frustration boiling hotter than hunger. Each chance, each effort was stolen by this rival. The sea, the forest, even the open plains were no longer its own. Survival meant more than hunting now. It meant outwitting a giant. The predator turned to the sea again. For days it tracked the rhythm of the tides, noting how fish became trapped in pools or how carcasses drifted ashore. It learned to follow the cries of birds and the flight of pterosaurs, which often revealed food before the scent reached the ground. It learned, too, that the megalosaur relied on brute force more than speed. Where the ground grew soft and water pooled, the giant slowed. Perhaps that was the key. One evening, as the tide receded, the smaller hunter spotted another opportunity. A large fish had washed ashore, gasping on the sand, its silver body thrashing weakly. The Eustreptospondylus darted forward and seized it, ripping into the slippery scales. At once the now familiar roar thundered from the forest. The megalosaur had come again, drawn by the scent and the sight of the smaller predator feeding. But this time the Eustreptospondylus was ready. Instead of fleeing inland, it seized the fish and dragged it into the shallows. The megalosaur pursued, its heavy body splashing into the surf. Waves crashed against its legs, slowing each step as water dragged at its mass. The smaller hunter darted nimbly between currents, staying just beyond reach. When the megalosaur lunged, the smaller predator veered aside, letting the giant stumble deeper. Salt water surged around the larger predator's chest, dragging it off balance. For a breath, the Eustreptospondylus had the upper hand. It hissed defiantly as the megalosaur struggled in the waves, its jaws snapping furiously at empty water. The smaller predator seized another bite of fish, then retreated safely to shallower sand. It was not a victory, but it was proof. The sea could be weapon as well as home. From that day, the struggle between them grew into a war strategy. Each encounter tested the wit of the smaller and the power of the larger. The megalosaur continued to dominate the forests and open plains, but along the shifting coast the balance had begun to tilt. The Eustreptospondylus learned to wait for tide and stormed to weaken its rival's strength. It grew bolder, stealing scraps from the carcasses of seals and reptiles washed ashore. Its body thickened again, muscles hardening beneath its scales as hunger no longer ruled every step. But tension only sharpened. The rivalry could not last forever. The megalosaur would not tolerate defiance without final resolution. The smaller predator knew it. Each morning when the sun rose and the tide turned, it felt the inevitability building like the pull of the moon on the sea. A clash greater than all before was coming. And when the storm clouds gathered over the coast, blackening the horizon, and the sea roared with fury, the predator knew the moment had arrived. The storm had raged for hours, but it was not the storm that carried the greatest danger. Across the swamp, where the water rose in furious waves, another predator moved with purpose. It was a rival male Eustreptospondylus, one as large and powerful as the first, yet hardened by scars that told of many victories. For days the two had stalked the same territory, hunting the same prey, and avoiding a direct clash, but hunger and pride now forced their paths together. The air was charged not only with thunder, but with the unspoken certainty that only one would leave the swamp alive. The first Eustreptospondylus stood tall, its ridged spine casting a jagged shadow in the flashing light. Its body tensed, every muscle trembling with readiness. Across the water, its rival let out a low rumble, a sound that shook the reeds and sent smaller reptiles fleeing for safety. Both beasts knew the rules of this ancient dance. They circled first, each testing the other's resolve. Their eyes locked, burning with hunger and fury. The swamp became their arena. Every sound seemed amplified: the crash of waves, the hiss of rain, the bellowing thunder. Yet all faded beneath the rhythm of their own breathing, deep, steady savage. The first strike came suddenly. The scarred rival lunged forward with astonishing speed, jaws snapping toward the neck of the younger male. The intended kill strike was met with a violent counter. The younger pivoted, slamming its massive skull into the side of its foe with bone-cracking force. Both toppled into the churning water, thrashing with tails, claws, and teeth. Mud rose like smoke. The reeds bent beneath their weight. Water churned red as shallow wounds opened across both bodies. Each roar rolled through the swamp louder than thunder. The storm above seemed almost a cheer for their destruction. The rival rose first, tearing at the shoulder of the younger male. Flesh ripped free in a spray of blood, and pain lit the younger's eyes. Yet pain did not weaken him. It sharpened him. He twisted and latched his jaws onto the rival's tail, biting with bone-shattering power. The rival howled in rage, thrashing desperately to break free, but the younger's grip was relentless. The swamp floor shook as the rival swung its tail like a weapon, slamming the younger against a boulder. The impact split stone and rattled bones, but the grip held. Only when the rival whipped again with ferocious strength did the younger release, tumbling back into the reeds. They paused, both panting, both bleeding, both burning with hatred. Lightning split the sky, framing their colossal silhouettes in blinding white. Neither would retreat. The swamp was too small for two hunters. With renewed fury, the scarred rival charged again, jaws gaping wide enough to crush bone. The younger waited until the last heartbeat, then twisted aside. The rival crashed headfirst into a fallen log, splintering into shards. Before it could recover, the younger clamped down on its neck. The struggle became savage beyond measure. Teeth cut deep through muscle veins and sinew. The rival thrashed, striking with claws, tearing flesh from the younger's side, yet the grip on its neck tightened with unstoppable force. Each second drained its strength. Its roars grew weaker, its thrashes slower. The younger's eyes glowed with primal victory. But victory was not without cost. The rival's claws left gouges along his ribs, blood pouring freely. His legs trembled, his chest burned with exhaustion, yet he refused to release. At last, with one final jerk, he crushed through bone, and the rival's body went limp. Silence followed. The rain eased. The thunder drifted far across the horizon. The swamp lay still except for the labored breathing of the survivor. He released the lifeless body, letting it fall into the rising flood. Blood mingled with rain water, staining the swamp dark. The younger Eustreptospondylus stood battered yet unbroken. His wounds throbbed, his body screamed with agony, but his spirit surged with triumph. This was his territory now, the swamp his domain. His roars broke the silence, announcing to every living creature that he was victor, that he was king. Faraway herds stirred uneasily. Flightless birds scattered from the trees. Even the crocodiles slid silently into deeper waters. The message was clear. The swamp had a new master, but the victory came with a heavy price. As the storm clouds drifted and pale light spread across the landscape, he felt the full weight of his wounds. Deep gashes still bled freely. His legs shook beneath his massive frame, yet he refused to collapse. He dragged himself from the water, climbing onto solid ground where he stood tall once more. In his eyes there burned not just hunger but legacy. This battle was not merely survival. It was the marking of an era. One life had ended, another had risen. The swamp will remember the cries that had shaken its skies. The climax of his struggle was etched into every scar, every broken reed, every trail of blood across the earth. The predator had faced his ultimate test and had emerged victorious, though scarred forever. He lifted his head once more and roared, his voice echoing through valleys, mountains, and rivers, a sound that promised dominion until another dared to challenge him. And in the silence after his cry, the swamp bowed to its new ruler. The swamp was quiet again, though silence after violence always carried its own weight. The rain had softened into a drizzle that tapped gently against the reeds, and ripples stretched outward where the water had been torn apart by the battle. The body of the fallen rival floated half, submerged, its dark form drifting slowly with the current. Fish began to circle it, already testing the edges of opportunity. The swamp wasted nothing. The victorious Eustreptospondylus stood on trembling legs at the edge of the clearing. His sides heaved with each breath, and his wounds glistened fresh against the pale light. Every movement sent pain lancing through his body, yet he remained upright. The strength that had carried him through the fight now seemed almost borrowed, as if it might vanish at any moment. Still he did not collapse. His instincts demanded endurance, for collapse meant death even in victory. Blood streaked his tail and ribs, painting long scars that would harden into marks of survival. He lowered his head to drink from the swamp water, yet even that simple act came with caution. His eyes scanned the horizon, ever watchful for opportunists. Smaller predators thrived in times like this, circling like shadows to claim what they could from the broken. The great hunter could not afford weakness. Hours passed. The storm clouds rolled away, leaving a sky bruised with purple and gold. Rays of sunlight stretched across the swamp, catching the mist and turning the battlefield into something almost sacred. Insects buzzed around the fallen body of the rival, and already scavengers stirred in the trees above. Life flowed on, as it always did. The swamp recognized no kings for long. The survivor moved slowly through the reeds, his gait unsteady. Each step left behind a smear of blood in the mud. He needed food and rest, but both were dangerous luxuries in his condition. Yet instinct guided him to a rise of dry ground where the water could not reach. There he collapsed with a heavy thud, the earth trembling beneath him. For a long time he lay still, his eyes half closed, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Memories of the fight echoed in his mind, not as thoughts, but as sensations. The tearing of flesh, the crash of bodies, the scream of thunder. Survival had cost him deeply, yet it had been unavoidable. In this land, life was claimed only through battle. Night fell, and with it came a cool calm. The stars glimmered faintly through drifting clouds. Frogs croaked along the water's edge, and insects filled the air with their constant hum. The swamp no longer felt like an arena, but like a cradle, holding the wounded victor in fragile balance. He slept in fits, his rest broken by the sharp sting of wounds. Dreams carried him back into the fight, his body reliving each violent strike. But every time he awoke, he was still alive and still king. The rival was gone. The territory was his. The next morning the air carried the sweet, raw decay. The rival's body had begun to sink deeper into the swamp, its weight claimed by mud and water. Scavengers fed greedily on what remained, and the sight filled the survivor with both reassurance and warning. Nature moved quickly. All kings became carrion in the end. He rose carefully, muscles stiff yet steady. The wounds were clotting now, though his body still carried the weakness of blood loss. He limped toward the heart of the swamp where herds sometimes grazed. Though weakened, he still needed to eat. The swamp gave no rest for long. As he moved, birds scattered before him, and smaller reptiles darted into burrows. The sound of his approach was enough to remind them that the ruler still lived. He might be scarred and slower, but his presence alone spoke of dominance. The swamp knew his roar, and as the morning sun stretched higher, casting golden light across the reeds, he lifted his head once more and let out a call. It was not the furious roar of battle, but a deep, steady announcement. The swamp echoed it back, carrying the sound across water and stone. The king had survived. The days that followed carried a slower rhythm. The wounds across the body of the Eustreptospondylus began to harden into scars. The sharp pain dulled into an ache that reminded him of his battle, yet no longer threatened to break him. Each step grew stronger, each movement steadier. He had faced death and walked away, which meant his place in the swamp remained unchallenged. The swamp itself moved on, as if nothing had happened. Water levels shifted with the rains, plants grew thick again around the marsh, and herds of small dinosaurs returned to graze where the battle had once scarred the ground. Nothing in this land held still for long. Life grew over wounds both of earth and of flesh. Yet for the victor the memory of the struggle remained etched deep within. Every scar carried story. Along his flank one long slash told the rival's teeth sinking deep, while another across his tail recalled a moment of desperate escape. His ribs bore marks of claws that had nearly broken through. He was a living record of conflict. To the swamp, these scars were simply survival. To him, they were proof of endurance and of a claim renewed. With time, his strength returned fully. Once more, he hunted through the shallows, striking swift against fish and reptiles that strayed into his path. Herds moved cautiously when his shadow stretched across the water. His roar carried farther than before, its tone sharpened by the authority of victory. Predators ruled only as long as they could defend their place. He had proven his worth, and the land responded. Yet victory was never eternal. Even as his strength returned, he sensed the quiet truth that had always haunted creatures of his kind. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another rival grew stronger. Somewhere another hunter sharpened claws on bark and tested muscles in the hunt. The swamp allowed no dynasty to last forever. For now he ruled, but one day he too would fall, and another would rise. This knowledge did not bring fear. Instead, it settled like a calm acceptance. His survival was not only about the moment, but about continuing the ancient rhythm that bound all life here. Predators and prey alike lived within that rhythm, and none could break it. The swamp was the true ruler. Creatures were only passing voices within its endless song. Seasons shifted. Rains came heavy, then gave way to heat. The Eustreptospondylus endured them all. He grew older, broader, and slower, yet still strong enough to hold his ground. Younger predators began to test him, watching from a distance, circling at the edges of his territory. He answered with roars that kept them cautious for now. The scars along his body thickened into ridges like badges of his reign. On one quiet evening, as the sun sank low and painted the swamp in gold, he stood on the rise where he had once collapsed after battle. The water shimmered around him, and the air carried the smell of life and decay mixed as always. He lowered his head to drink his reflection rippling across the surface. In it he saw not just himself, but the history written in his body. He lifted his head and gave a final low call, not a challenge, but a presence. The swamp answered with echoes of birds, frogs, and insects blending into a chorus. In that moment, it was clear that though he might not rule forever, his existence had been part of something far greater. The battle, the scars, the survival. These were not only a story, but the story of the swamp itself. Life continued. The herds grazed, the scavengers fed, the rivers flowed. The Eustreptospondylus turned from the water and moved into the reeds, his massive body, swaying with each step. His reign would end one day, but not today. Today he remained the survivor, the hunter, the ruler, and the swamp accepted him as such.